right, I think we're back live now. Hopefully everybody had a chance to grab a coffee or a tea to get settled in. And everybody can hear me okay. Looking for a thumbs up from our moderator. Looks good. All right. Well, thanks for all of those, putting up with all those technical difficulties and bearing with us as we get everything worked out. Hopefully now all the kinks are said and done for the conference, and you can just sit back and enjoy listening to all of us talk about pollinators and their conservation. So I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Olivia Carroll. She's been studying native bees for over 25 years. She received her bachelor in biology from Utah State University while conducting a survey of bees in Pinnacles National Monument in California. Her Master's of Science is also from Utah State University and involved a study of the bee fauna of the 2 million acre Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which I bet a lot of you are probably familiar with from the news. From her PhD, she got it at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. She focused on the evolution of host choice for a group of specialist bees called Diadasia that visit globe mallow and cactus flowers. And she's the co-author of 2 books. I bet you've read one of them: The Bees in Your Backyard and a Field Guide to North America's Bees and the Common Bees of Eastern North America. She's currently working on a field guide to Western bees. That's no easy task. As well as conducting several large-scale surveys for bees in New Mexico. In her spare time, she teaches science to middle school girls, and she lives in New Mexico and touts her husband and children as excellent field assistants. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia. She's going to share her screen now, and I'm looking forward to hearing a very informative keynote.
I hope it works out that way. Thanks, Adrian. That was great. Okay, hang on one sec while I make sure this is going. Y'all can see that? Okay, hold on one sec here. Okay, I'm going to go forward one slide to make sure this is working. Let's see what happens. How's that? Did it go forward for everyone? Good. Okay, this is the most important slide in the whole thing. I'm just kidding. So Adrian gave a great introduction, and thank you. And I'm thrilled to be here and be able to talk to all of you about something that I think about all the time. It's an important topic for me and something that's kind of in the back of my mind always. I do a lot of field work in the summers. This last year I got about 28 days of camping in with these 2 cuties right here. These are my daughters. And you can tell in there they look really thrilled to be out with me. This was a few years ago, and I have to say things have improved. So this summer, when I was out with them, we got a little hot, and they were kind of not enjoying being out. So I offered them a deal. I would pay them $5 for every bee they caught for me, and I handed them nets. And I was out $75 by the end of about an hour. So things are looking up for them, not so much for my pocketbook, but when I'm not doing that, I teach middle school girls about science at the Santa Fe Girls School where I live. Sometimes I also teach about bees. I'll travel around and give lectures on how to identify different bees. And I've kind of summed up some of that in a few of these books here that Adrian talked about. And the most important thing on this slide isn't the pictures of the books there, it's the information on the side. So do like a screenshot, save that for yourself, take a picture, whatever, so that if you think of a question after today that you forgot to ask, you can reach out. This is where you can find Joe and I. We talk about bee stuff on social media quite often, and you can always email us at thebeesinyourbackyard@gmail.com. And when I'm not doing any of those things, I'm out swinging a net trying to find bees. It's brought me a lot of satisfaction for a long time now, and I'm really happy to be able to share with you a little bit about some of what I've gleaned from all of this. So just to start and make sure we're all talking about the same thing, you guys already know this, so I don't have to spend long here, but native solitary bees is the thing I'm going to talk about today. So these are the bees that live solitarily. There's no queen, there's no workers, there's no hives, there's no honey. Most of them are nesting in the ground, and it's usually a nest that they've built somewhere. Maybe it's in a twig, maybe a snail shell, something like that. But the nest that is built by the female is the same place where she lays her eggs that she provides for. So she does all of the work of the queens and the workers together. And they're diverse. In North America alone, we think there's somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 different species distributed in kind of interesting ways. And what's really cool about them is that they're really efficient and effective pollinators because they actively gather pollen from flowers, which isn't something we can say about a lot of insects, that they actually will go through and do that. Many of these species co-occur. So one acre, say my backyard, could have between 20 and 50 different species in it, and maybe Adrian's would have a different 20 or 50 species. And that's across the field season. So they come and go and change, which makes them kind of similar to flowering plant communities. They're kind of patchy. They change from place to place. The reproductive part, that adult life portion, which is the same as the flower on the plant, is pretty short-lived and changes across the season. And who and how many, of course, can change from year to year. The difference, of course, is that bees move. So that makes it a little trickier to try and figure out what's going on. Flowers, when they're done, you know, once the flowers are gone, you can still identify them by their little skeletal remains, but you can't really do that for bees in the field. You have to catch them while they're out. So what is a bee population? And that should say, I think a bee community maybe is a better thing. And a bee community is a population, a group of different bee species that co-occur in an area. It could be a habitat, a landscape patch, a bee house, could be my backyard. But some component of this changes over time or over a season. So let's think about that for a minute. We can have, here's 7 different bee populations that we can talk about here. So you can think about not just the fact that there are 7 different bee species, say in somebody's backyard, but also that each of them is represented by a different number of individuals. So say Serratina pacifica has 10, Hylaeus affinis there has 76. And then we can think about how that changes also over time. So maybe in 2020, Diadasia diminuta was present with 12 individuals in my yard, but the next year there weren't any of them. And I want you to know I made this up. They haven't actually disappeared from my yard. Or maybe Hylaeus affinis has become more abundant in the last few years. And we can also look at how this changes over space. So maybe my backyard compared to Adrian's backyard, I have more Serratina pacifica and he has less, and he has more Lasioglossum albifrons and I have less. So what do we know about these bee communities and bee populations already? Well, as a bee biologist, I, of course, am going to say not as much as we want to. I'm probably going to say that until the day I die. I'm never going to know quite as much as I want. So I'm going to start with sort of broad scale, big picture stuff. At the broad scale, we know there's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 species around the world. We know that there's between 3,500 and 4,000 in the US. And we even know a little bit about where they are. So for example, here, we know that there's 770 bee species east of the Mississippi River. And to compare that to birds, we know that there's about 1,100 birds in all of North America, which is kind of an interesting thing to compare to. Just east of the Mississippi River, we have almost the same number of bees as all the birds in North America, which is funny when you think about that iNaturalist statistic that Adrian threw up a little bit earlier. So how are these distributed by state? This isn't complete. I want to start by saying that. This isn't complete, but it does give a general sense of what's going on. So here's each of the states, and you can see this general trend as we go from north to south and from east to west. Bee species richness tends to increase, so that when you look at California, there's 1,643 different bee species all in that one state there. Of course, there's a lot of really unique habitats there, and it ranges in elevation from the highest point in the lower 48 to the lowest, and all that latitude, all that stuff going on there. So of course, there's a lot of bees, but there is a general trend toward the southwest that makes the southwest, where I live, and even here in Colorado, one of the best places to really study and get to know bees. And it's interesting to think that at the broad scale, we have these interesting facts that we know about bees. We know there's roughly 1,000 species in Arizona. We know that east of the Mississippi River, there's 770 species. We know about how many are in the US. But when you zoom in a little bit closer, all of that mid-range is what we're missing when it comes to. At the county level, we know very little about how many bees are in each county. Maybe I do know how many bees are in my backyard. I actually don't, but maybe I did. But that going up, that middle scale is where we really need to be focusing our efforts. We also know roughly something about ecoregions for bees. So this is the number of genera, and this is a rough map that's still in progress here. But generally speaking, the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts have the highest number of bee species. The redder the color, the more bee genera, sorry, the more bee genera are in an area and moving towards blue. So you can see that. What's interesting to me is that if you look at bee species, it tends to change just a little bit, so that the Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau tend to have more bee species. Okay, so we have some general knowledge about bees here. What do we know about declines in bees? How are these big numbers we're talking about changing over time, and what do we know? Well, not a lot. So imagine for a minute, let's go back in time to, what did you say, Adrian? 1960 maybe was the year that most of the Bombus occidentalis records have been collected. So I have Osmia aglaya. We can do the same thing for either of those bees. If we know that there were 58 individuals in 2020, that's great, but it doesn't tell us whether that bee is increasing or decreasing or staying the same, because we don't know how many were there in 2010. If I go out and wander around kind of haphazardly with my net and maybe catch a bee and maybe don't, I'm not going to be able to say whether that bee was there in the past or whether that one individual represents an increase or a decrease, or we're saying the same. Wandering around with a net isn't quite enough to tell us how bee populations are doing. Okay, so let me talk you through a couple studies that have tried to get around the fact that for the last 100 years of collecting bees, we haven't really standardized our efforts on these at all. So we really want to know how bees are doing now, but we have very little foundational baseline data to start from to really assess this. So here's a few fun ways that people have tried to deal with this issue. And one way to do it is to focus in on just one bee group. Rather than try to establish what's going on with all of the bees, look at just one bee group. So this is a paper I really like. It came out a little while ago now. It's been some time since it came out. But of the 45 bumblebee species in North America, this group of researchers focused in on just about 8 of them that they thought they had really solid data to figure out one way or another. And they figured out where they'd been in the past and revisited a lot of those areas to see if those bees were still there. And they found that several species are in decline. So one western species, which interestingly is the one that you brought up, Adrian, and then 3 eastern species tend to be declining wherever they occur. Interestingly, they also found that there were a few species that are becoming more abundant than they used to be. So even within just this one genus, we have very disparate things happening to the bees. Another creative way that people have looked at bees and sort of tried to assess changes in bee populations and bee communities over time works because of a wonderful scientist, Charles Robertson, who lived a long time ago, 130 years ago now, outside of Carlinville, Illinois. And he would go out probably, I'm imagining, on a horse. Maybe he had a cart with him. I'm not sure. It was, who knows what it was like in Illinois then. But he would record bees and the flowers on which they occurred with meticulous precision. I could never have done what he did, but he wrote down absolutely everything that he saw on these flowers, and it gave us the ability to revisit these same spots and recollect the areas that he had been in to see how the plants and pollinators had changed. And they focused on just 26 of the many flowers that he recorded, all of which were flowers that occurred kind of in the spring months, and created this insane looking web over here. And I'll walk you through sort of what this looks like. But overall, the scientists that revisited these areas found 109 different bee species. Interestingly, of the original linkages that were recorded by Robertson, only 24% of those linkages persisted. And they found several new interactions, so plants or new bees on the same plants that he had visited. So on the left side of this, we can see the 26 plants running up and down the left side. And on the right side are the bees. So if it's in red, it's a bee that he saw that's not there anymore. And if it's in black, it's a relationship that still is continuing as it did then. And if it's in, hold on, let me go forward one, there. And if it's in blue, it's a new relationship that's formed. So 407 of the 532 interactions that he looked at, of course, are not there anymore, which is interesting. None were because the flowers weren't there. The flowers were still there. It was all because the bees weren't there. There's some interesting things from this, and we can kind of zoom in and look at a few of these. So here is an example. Many of the bees that he saw that weren't there anymore were things like nomata. Can you see this? There's a whole list, maybe, 13 or so different species of nomata. There's some sphecodes down there as well. And nomata, sphecodes, and even that stelus that you see are all kleptoparasitic bees. So these are bees that sneak into the nest of another bee in order to use the pollen that's in there for the host bees, babies, and which means they don't really care which flowers they visit, which means they're probably highly susceptible to any sort of invasive species that might end up in an area, and they may go visit something that's a little easier to get nectar from than the plants that historically were there. So just because those linkages aren't there doesn't mean those bees are necessarily gone. It just means they aren't visiting the same plants they used to. Who knows? Maybe that's something that happens naturally. Maybe that's just what bees do over time, kind of a succession that happens. The other thing is that we don't know his sampling effort. We don't know how many hours he spent outside looking at these flowers. Maybe it takes so long on a horse with your cart that you don't really have much time, and now we're spending more time or less time. We don't really know, and so it's hard to make a true comparison about this. So here's another study, and I like this one, and it was a pretty general study here that looked just generally at presence and absence and how presence and absence might have changed in Eastern North American bee species. So which bees that used to be in the Eastern US are still in the Eastern US. So this is the paper where that number about 770 comes from. And they found 770 bee species historically in Eastern North America, and then using this huge data set of digitized records for all of these different collections around the US, they looked to see, of the bees that were there prior to 1990, which ones are still there now. And they found that 95% of them are still there. They're still present and they're still occurring and whatever. But the 37 species that were rare before 1990 are ones that were kind of on the edge of their range and maybe come and go more naturally anyway. The downside to this, of course, is that it's qualitative. So if we compare this to that bumblebee study from earlier, we know that several bumblebees are less abundant than they used to be. And this data only shows us that they're still around. They haven't gone away completely, but doesn't show us that they're in decline. Here's another one I really like, that instead of looking, this is another creative way. I like creative science. It's kind of cool. Rather than looking at quantities of bees overall, so each of the bees and how the numbers of them had changed, they looked at guilds. They looked at shifts in community composition. So are specialists more likely to be gone from an area? Are bees that fly for a really short period of time with a narrow phenology going away? Are large body size bees going away, or the small ones? What is it that's really changing most over the last 100 years or so? And they found some modest declines, most significantly in bombus, as we've seen in lots and lots of papers. But they did find significant shifts in community composition, mostly in cities and urban areas that they've been looking at. And they found that specialists, bees that don't fly for very long, and bees with large body sizes are the ones most likely to change over time, which surprised me a little bit. And if I were to have hypothesized, I would have guessed it would be the small body sized bees, but really they can't go anywhere, whereas the big ones have more of an option of leaving. And then this one, finally, this is the last one I'll talk about. And this one came out pretty recently. This is, I think, the beginning of this year. And they looked at that GBIF data, the same stuff that Adrian was talking about earlier, and they grouped it by decade and looked to see if there were any changes in bee species richness by decade over time. And their conclusion, very generally, they have lots of conclusions and they have lots of sort of guesses as to why they're seeing what they do that are actually pretty interesting. But their big conclusion is that rare bees are becoming rarer and common bees are becoming more common. So that overall, even though we're collecting more specimens than we have in the past, there's more data being put into GBIF, the number of species that are represented by all of those additional specimens is actually less. So what does this all mean? What does this mean for me as a scientist trying to figure things out? Well, from my point of view, what this means is that there's going to be some winner bees and some loser bees. We already have evidence to suggest that bumblebee species are definitely ones that have not fared well in recent years. But again, we can't say that for all of the bumblebees, just some of them. And it seems that certain groups of bees may be more vulnerable to habitat fragmentation or the loss or change of flowering resources on which they're relying. Maybe pesticides are factoring in here, the spread of pathogens. Maybe they're being outcompeted by honeybees. The big picture is that landscape level changes from the last 75 years are the kind that are known to be detrimental to some groups of solitary bees. So the real question is, who is in which group? So if we're planting in cities, I heard about the wonderful work that's being done right now in Boulder and all of these cool little projects with community gardens and things like that, which is excellent. If we know who the loser bees are, we can target those gardens to really help support the bees that most need our help. Maybe we can plant more flowers that attract bumblebees if they seem to be the ones that are in decline. So figuring out which groups are struggling in the face of these disturbances is the real ticket. And of course, this means we need to measure bee populations. We need to figure out how to quantify bee populations so we can figure out who the losers are. Of course, this requires gathering quantifiable baseline data, and that's not quite as easy as it might seem. The struggle to do this in a way that's useful, can be broadly applied, and that isn't too detrimental to the bee populations that we're so worried about it's a real struggle. This is a hard problem to solve. There's been lots and lots of debate, lots of literature, lots of ideas thrown out. Which techniques should we use? How often should we sample? How do we combine our efforts for greatest effect? And where do we focus so that all of these things end up being as useful as possible? We're still trying to figure all of that out. We're still working on this. So in order to really understand the problem, I've made this really simple graph, and you'll have to forgive my horrible PowerPoint skills here, but I think it'll get the point across. So imagine a graph, and on the x-axis here, we have the number of specimens collected. I feel like I'm teaching 7th grade biology when I say that. I swear I did this yesterday. And then up on the y-axis is the number of bee species. So we know that in an area there is a top number of bee species. There is a number there. And we know that the number of specimens we collect is going to move us towards that line. So at first, everything we collect is going to be a new bee species. It's going to grow our number of bee species that we know. And the more specimens we collect, the closer we're going to get to that line. Not in a beautiful, straight, linear way, because eventually we'll start collecting the same thing over and over, and it'll take more collecting to get one new species. But eventually, we should approach that line and be able to see how many species are in an area because we've collected enough specimens. And after that, everything we collect is just additional data. And so the key is really to get to this point right here. We want to get to the point where we're collecting everything that's in an area, but not too much extra. 1, because we have to identify them. 2, because we have to store them. And 3, because they're good pollinators, and we should probably leave them out there. Okay, so that's the goal. How to accomplish that goal, especially when the line tends to shift up and down from year to year as bees migrate into an area or leave an area, or bees that are bet hedging and are waiting in the ground don't come up every year. The number of bee species that occurs in a place can change. And what do we do about the fact that our techniques, how we sample these bees, also determines how close we get to that? If we use just one method like pan traps, we may never see all of the species that are in an area because some of them avoid pan traps. And what do we do about the fact that what's in my backyard is going to be very different from what's in somebody else's backyard? And so that number, that green line we're working towards, changes as you move across the landscape. How do we do this? This is a little bit tricky. Well, I would say that we do the best we can. We may never get that actual number, but I think with time and effort and some creativity, we can learn enough about the bees to determine winners and losers with a fair degree of certainty. So let's start with that creativity part. There's so many ways we can creatively is that okay? Oh, okay. We can creatively get at this. All of which, of course, relies on more data. And this is the truth. When I started studying bees, 20 some years ago, I felt like I was the one that had to gather all of that data. I had a responsibility as a scientist to be the one to gather the data to answer this question. And looking around, I could see that there were a handful of soldier scientists with me out there to do that, but there was literally just a handful. And what we have now is this amazing group of concerned citizens, volunteers who are being trained up who can help collect that data. So it's no longer an impossible goal to get enough data to really answer these questions. We can learn things from looking at changes in genetic diversity. That doesn't necessarily even mean, collecting a whole bunch of new species. It just means collecting some maybe at the edges of their ranges. What can we get from bee collections that we haven't already gleaned from them? Could we collect pollen off of bees' legs to see and create those same pollinator networks that were created from Charles Robertson's stuff, and see how over time bee flower collections have changed? Or maybe there's some other new amazing statistical technique that we'll figure out to try and work on this. How can we combine our efforts across states and programs and studies and different scientists and collaborate in ways that our data is as meaningful as possible for all of us? How can we involve all of the other people out there who love bees as much as us scientists do to really answer this? And are there certain bees that maybe we should prioritize because they tell us about the whole community? They can act as sort of canary bees and really tell us what's going on. So first of all, can we quantify bee communities and bee populations? And I would say the short answer is yes. We can kind of figure this out. If you've watched any of the videos preloaded for today's summit, or if you stick around for some of the that are coming, I've seen the titles on a few of those, or will know that counting bees in an area is totally doable. And I'm going to show you a few of the places that I've collected and counted bees to kind of get at that. And yeah, it's a moving target, but with standardized methods and plenty of caveats in place, we can do a couple things. So let me give you a few examples. We can show how many bees are in a large area. So think about the early study of all those bees in the east. That's a really large area. And we can even look at bees in smaller areas. So this is from my master's, and I'll talk about it here for a second. This is Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, and it's in south central Utah. So that little map up at the top kind of shows where it is down there at the southern end of the Colorado Plateau. And all of those little dots are places where during my master's, which took 4 years of just the data, kind of ridiculous. Those are places where we stopped to collect. So we collected a total of 660 bee species, but it took us 80,000 individual bees to get to that number. This was a total of 1,632 days of collecting. And what's interesting is, let me say here real quick, the yellow dots there are plots. So these were 1 hectare in size. That's 100 meters by 100 meters in size. And they were collected in a standardized way. So for 45 minutes in the morning and the afternoon on a given day, every 2 weeks for the duration of the field season, which lasted for 6 months. So every 2 weeks for 6 months, that same place would be revisited over and over again. And what's interesting to me is that of the 660 species, about 72% of them all were collected in those plots. So they ended up being fairly representative of things overall. And so from this, now I can extrapolate and kind of say in this region there are 660 species, but I can also zoom in on any one of those little tiny yellow dots there and say how many bees are in just that tiny little place and kind of compare between those areas. So yes, I want to point out, first of all, that we talked about we need creativity and we need time and we need a lot of effort. This is a lot of time and effort, but I think there are other ways that we can accomplish the same thing here. So let's see now, with that data, I'm able to now quantify bee populations over time. So let me show you a couple ways that we've sort of approached and looked at this. My favorite is to look at how plant-bee relationships change from year to year in the same plot. So this is just one of those little 1 hectare plots, and it's across just 3 years, 2001, 2002, and 2003. And the blue dot in the center is a plant, And then the red dots around it are the bees that were visiting it there. Or are they orange? They're more orange, I guess, on my screen here. And this is across the season. So early May, late May, early June, every time we visited that plot. And you'll see there are some times when we visited the plot, nothing was there. Nothing blooming, no bees. It happens. But what's really interesting to me is not necessarily the changes across a year that's expected, but to see that between years, which plants are the most important to the bees changes. And it seems to change naturally. This isn't a place going through a lot of disturbance or anything. This is a natural sort of change happening in this place from year to year. So some sort of variation in bee-plant relationships must be sort of a natural thing that happens. At least it seems to be. And we can tell that by collecting data in this quantified way over a number of years. So another way to look over years is, I'm going to switch studies now and talk about this one. This is Pinnacles National Monument in California. And this is where I caught my first bee. Guys, my first bee was a honeybee. It's not the best thing I've ever said, but there it is. The first time I ever caught a bee was at Pinnacles National Monument. I was 18. I was super excited to have been offered this chance to go out and collect bees in this place. I took off an entire quarter of college, my sophomore year, to go do this. And I had to camp the whole time. It was lovely. It was really great. And I liked it so much, I went back for another 3 years after that. And we have 393 species that were known from that area by the end of my work there. And I should add too, it took me an extra year to graduate with my undergrad degree because I was having so much fun collecting bees and pinnacles, I forgot to take classes. Okay, so what's cool is we got this nice data set to begin with, and then we were able to go back and resample this area from 2010 to 2012 and see how the bee species had changed. And so there's more bee species known from that area now than when I was there. But this is the cool part. How do the bee species change? How similar are communities from one year to another across all of those years? So on the lower half of this, in the lower left side, is the number of genera that were in common. And this is on a scale from 0 to 1. It's what we call similarity. And if the number is closer to 1, it means it's more similar to each other. So you can see in general, the same genera are collected in any given year. And then you can look, and I should point out too that roughly the same number of species were caught, or specimens were caught in most of these years. So that's kind of been weighted and accounted for in here. And then you can look, so 1996 compared to 97, 0.68, 0.64, 0.71, et cetera, et cetera. There's some change in bee species, but not a significant change. So the community is staying fairly similar across time, which is kind of interesting. So we can use data, even if it's not complete, even if I miss some bee species that were out there, I'm still able to draw some important conclusions about how this place is changing over time and not worry too much about the fact that I haven't gotten all the way to that green line at the top. Okay, the other thing we can do is use net collections and some more passive sampling methods to look at bee populations in different habitats. So this is one area I'm working in New Mexico, and this is a longer video than it probably should be, but it's so pretty. I love where I get to work. So here's a 1 hectare plot that I'm working in, and then I can compare that to, say, this habitat here and see some big differences. I can compare it to areas that have been burned recently, and I can see whether and which kinds of disturbance are tolerable or maybe even preferable to bees. So this is just a really rough graph kind of showing here 5 different habitats, 3 habitats: pinyon juniper, sagebrush, and riparian areas. And it's showing how these different places differ in terms of how many specimens that I got in each one. I'm still working on the species ID, so that's why the species aren't up here. But you can see burned areas tended to have really high abundance. Grazed areas, not too bad. Statistically, there's not a huge difference, but it's not as low as I would have maybe guessed. And then I can look at riparian areas. So we can use this same quantifiable data not only to assess whether bee communities are changing over time, but just how they change across space and how to best manage the land for these different things. And this was surprising to me and not something I expected to study, but New Mexico has been going through a really serious drought the last couple of years. And so now, in addition to that, I'm able to assess how bees handle these mega droughts. So just to make sure that's clear, this is a plot in 2020, the spring of 2020, and this was this year, the same exact plot in the spring of 2021. So pretty dramatic. So there is a lot to be gained from doing these studies. I think there's a lot of ways that we can do this. I think the biggest impediment might be something like this. So this is one of my bee heroes here. Dr. Carril says there's no doubt that bees from the number of species, the ease with which they're collected, and the restricted distribution of many afford excellent material for defining zoological regions and life zones. That they have not been used to any extent for such purposes must be explained by the inadequacy of existing collections and records, and especially the difficulty of determining species. So that was 1906, and I say ditto. Not much has changed. We have these beautiful collections of bees, but the time and effort that goes into really understanding what is in those collections and what those species are really relies on a handful of experts right now, and that's kind of a bit of a bottleneck. That being said, I will say that maybe the biggest change that I've seen that I'm really excited about in the last 25 years since I started. When I started in Pinnacles National Monument, it's in sort of central California, right next to the coast. And so it sees a lot of visitors every year. And I collected along trails, so I'd be out with my nets and people would stop and ask me if I was collecting butterflies or fish. I got asked about fish sometimes. And I would explain I was collecting bees. And the immediate response was to share with me the story of that one time they had been stung. That's what people want to talk about. 20 years ago. Now when I meet people on trails and they ask what I'm doing, they still mention butterflies and fish. But when we get around to bees, the first question they ask is, are our bees okay? Are our bees going to make it? What can we do for the bees? And it's changed. It's no longer the story about being stung. It's genuine concern for these pollinators. And I think through education and through collaboration and finding ways for different groups of people, not just scientists, but people on iNaturalist and people who work with gardens, master gardeners, all of those things can make a big difference for this. So here's some ways that I think conservation efforts around bees can be best amplified through the help of lots of other people who are interested. Through education, not only do the bees benefit because they have more gardens to visit, maybe the use of pesticides can be slowed a little bit until we know more what's going on. Maybe we can get private land owners, so large ranches and things, to be involved and make better restoration efforts that keep bee resources in mind. And maybe we can have healthier sort of overall urban environments. I mean, the plants benefit more than just the bees when they're planted in cities. Through sort of fundraising and getting people involved in policies and actions in that sort of sense, listing species can be an impediment, certainly, but also a great way to sort of funnel taxpayer money towards bees that might be on the losing end, that might be among those losers. And then, of course, we can also get volunteers to do real science. And I know we're going to hear today from two groups of people that have very successfully been able to get volunteers out there doing work that is more than just a picture on iNaturalist, but is actually super beneficial and helpful to scientists who are trying to do work. And so I'm going to stop right there, and I'll stop with this cute, maybe I can get this picture to work, of my daughters out there collecting bees, the best field workers that I have. Should I stop sharing here to do this? Okay. All right.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Olivia, for such an awesome talk. And I think it's good for everybody in the room here to give her a round of applause. Everybody who's joining virtually can do some virtual applause. I don't know if there's a little hand wave icon or anything in this. And so we've gotten a number of questions in the chat and the Q&A. I've been taking some notes myself, and we have a couple of special guests in the background. So if they happen to have any burning questions, feel free and raise your hands, and I can reiterate those questions to Olivia. So, I think you brought up a whole lot of really cool and interesting points that a lot of people that are at this summit probably haven't ever thought about before, right? And one of the first questions I always get asked and came up in the chat window is, why do we have to kill the bees, right? And so a lot of people are like, how do you know that you're not catching the same bees over and over again? Well, it's because we do destructive sampling, right? And so I wondered if you would just speak for just a moment about the importance of that.
Yeah, I also get asked this question a lot. And, you know, I love bees. And so going out and killing a bee isn't something that I take lightly at all. So I'm really careful about my collecting techniques, and I try really hard not to oversample an area. But I've also spent the time sitting down and doing the math about what it takes to oversample. So let's use Grand Staircase, where I worked for my master's, as an example. So that's an area at the time that I worked there, it was 2 million acres, and then it went down to 1 million. I think it's almost back up to 2 million. But anyway, at the time that I was working there, it was about 2 million acres. And over the course of 4 years, we collected, let's round up and say 100,000 individual bees. So 4 years, 100,000 individual bees, we can divide that and say that's about 25,000 bees per year across 2 million acres. It works out to about a bee specimen, not species, a bee specimen for every 4 acres per year. So think about, I don't know, what's something people would know, about 4 football fields, walking into 4 football fields, taking 1 bee out of that area and taking it home with you. So I think it takes a lot more than we might think to really oversample an area, especially because we're not there every day. We're there for a snapshot in time. And in that way, it's maybe more similar to going in to get your blood drawn, right? You take a small sample from your body and you use that to draw some conclusions about the health of yourself. And we can do the same thing with bees. We can take a small little sample from an area and use it to assess, hopefully, the health of something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that was a great explanation. And I always like to reiterate to people that, not only, we're taking a small proportion of the bees within the community to be able to do this kind of research. Bees are dying all the time from cars going by, from, your cat eating them like mine does in the windowsill, from all kinds of stresses. And that's not even including the existential threats that they face from like climate change and pesticides. So I always argue that the value of the specimens we collect are worth more than just their individual lives, because they go into natural history collections, which will use them for multiple purposes, like revising our taxonomies, helping us develop new tools to be able to identify them so that we may not have to collect specimens in the future, right?
Absolutely. And I think you could add on to that too. I mean, I'm still using specimens. We still all use specimens from 100 years ago. That bee, once it's collected, I don't know if anyone out there has ever met a taxonomist or hung out with them, but those little insects on pins are handled as if they're like the queen's jewels. They are precious, valuable things, and I don't think it's not taken lightly to take those.
Yeah, but there are considerations we take in order to minimize our impacts on local populations when we do our research. And I thought it was interesting in your talk, and some people brought up in the questions that, one of the problems of like having to sample thousands and thousands of bees to get the diversity is those long redundant series of the common bees. And, I don't know, it's the same thing with iNaturalist data too, that the most common things are the most likely to be seen and collected over a photograph as they are with a net. So I don't know, do you have any insight as to what you think future direction should be like in terms of sampling to maximize what we want to detect, which are those rare species, which are by definition hard to detect? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the solution there is. I don't like storing those redundant ones either that you get over and over again. I have noticed though, like, I sample the same area and I have sampled the same areas for 4 or 5 years in a row. And the abundance of the common bees doesn't change. There may be 1,000 Halictus tripartatus one year. There's also 1,000 the next year, and the next, and the next, and the next. So I'm not sure it's necessarily having an effect on those common bees in those areas to do that, to end up with more than you need. And the value of getting that rare bee in that sample, I think almost makes it worth it. Yes, I hope that someday there are ways that we can sample without taking those. But in my plots where I'm working, I am going to take those samples, and I always will, because if I don't, I'm skewing the data that I have at the end, and I end up with relative proportions that change. And then when I say that this bee was super abundant, well, maybe that's because I didn't collect the actual really abundant one, because I was bored with it. I will say also, one of the things that I've started doing is taking videos as often as possible and pictures, especially of the larger bees. If I'm in an area, especially in the fall, you'll end up with a whole bunch of bumblebees all at once that are just like a final hurrah. And once I've taken enough that I know which species are there, I'll just take pictures of the rest so that I have that abundance data without having taken an actual sample. I can't do that with the smaller ones, but the big ones, yeah.
Cool. Well, we've got lots of other questions
Okay.
in the chat window. Sonia wanted to know why there were no numbers for Michigan in your present. I forget which slide it was in, but it's a common issue that we have big holes. I know data from Michigan.
Maybe my laziness. Maybe I haven't put it on there yet. Is there? Do we know a number yet for Michigan? Do we have? Is there one out? There's one. I'll put it on then. Sorry, Sonia. I just don't have it on there.
FYI, our local Michigan expert is also sitting in the background. So there is a number for Michigan. We just don't have it up there yet.
Okay, I can add it on. It's a random slide I put together to kind of indicate the general trend and not to be an actual documentation of what we had for each state. And I'm sure those numbers have changed some since I made that slide.
We had a question about who IDs your bees. You are a bee expert. Do you do everything?
I do most of it. I trade. That's what you do, right? So for example, there's a bee expert who lives in Logan, Utah, and we've agreed to trade. He's going to do all of my osmia and maybe most of my megachilety for me. In exchange, I'll do what I can with some dialectus and things like that. And the other thing too is the data that comes with those specimens is so valuable that sometimes someone will identify your specimens in return for the data off of the labels that are in there. And so, yes, I get help when I can, but I do a lot of at least the morpho sorting and then taking it to a reference collection to verify my IDs on my own.
Do you have any advice for researchers? So many people are now getting into bee study, have the taxonomic expertise, and are looking for people to do identifications. Any advice for people who are wanting to get into those things?
I would say that if you can train yourself to be a taxonomist, I mean, you'll have a job for life. That might be a good career for some 10 or 20 or 30. We need more bee scientists who are willing to become taxonomists and take on that very challenging task. And I have to say, it is a daunting one, but truly once you kind of get into it and just kind of dive down the rabbit hole, it's not that bad. It's really not. I think it's more just, it feels hard because they're so tiny. But I mean, think of how many people can tell apart different warblers based on half an eye ring. It's really no different. It's just smaller. That's all. Yeah.
So here's a question that I've gotten more increasingly. It came up in the chat. Do we know about honeybee wild bee conflicts? Urban areas I've seen a lot of urban beekeeping in recent years, and so people often ask me, should we be concerned about honeybees and how they interact with wild bees? So, thoughts?
I was invited to talk at the New Mexico Beekeeper Association meeting, and I stupidly came up with a talk that talked about how bad honeybees were in the environment. Maybe not my smartest move. No, I would say from the research that I did to prepare for that talk, that what I concluded was that in agricultural settings, so non-natural environments, in fact, native and honeybees pair really well together, and the best pollination occurs when both are encouraged to be in an area. Honeybees sometimes kind of get in the groove, and it helps to have another bee come along and disturb them because they'll move and better pollination happens. And then the honeybees, sometimes there are certain kinds of plants they don't want to visit. They're kind of picky and stuff, or flowers they don't want to visit. And so having the native bees around can supplement and really increase fruit and seed set. In urban environments, I mean, it's such an artificial environment anyway. I would say that the go-to answer would be that As long as there are abundant floral resources for everybody, you don't really need to get rid of them or anything like that. Just make sure there's enough to go around. I would say in desert environments or areas where floral resources are scarce, honeybees have been shown repeatedly, and albeit a little bit anecdotally, but they have been shown to outcompete native bees for scarce resources. So when there's not enough to go around, in the middle of a desert, in a dry alpine meadow in the summer, even in Ohio in the middle of the summer, there's probably some interaction, and it probably favors the honeybee over the native bees. One thing that we do know, and many people have done this with their data, is that if you look at floral resources and bees, you can see that bee richness and abundance increases as floral resources increase, which means that bees are floral resource limited. They are limited by the amount of flowers that are there. So when you add a huge 30,000 additional extra bees to an area for those same floral resources, it's kind of makes intuitive sense that there should be a decrease in the native bees for that.
Yeah, and a lot of people talk about this dichotomy between wild and honeybee researchers, and I like to tell people, I'm not on one side or the other myself.
Yeah,
I'm on the side of knowledge, and so honeybees are by far our most important insect, probably because we depend on them for so much crop pollination. And where and when and how we manage our honeybees, we're only now starting to add the context of the impacts that they have on wild bees.
Yeah.
And so it's just another aspect to honeybee management to take into consideration the impacts that they could have on wild bees. And for any kind of grower or homeowner, what your goals are as, a bee enthusiast. If you want to conserve native bees, then maybe getting honeybees aren't the best thing to do. If you want to educate your kids about bees, for sure, having an interactive beehive in your backyard is fascinating. Right. So I think it really depends on what you want to get out of it.
That's great.
I had a question here from Liam, who was wondering in your slide that showed the 3 years in the interaction of bees and flowers, so all the exploded plots. They were just curious what the one that was so attractive was. One of them had 10 bees.
I can tell you. Hang on one sec. Let's go back here.
It might be a good segue into my next question.
Okay, good. Hold on. Let's see. Where was I? That was down here. It's right here. This explosion right here. Oh, that's a willow. So this was a riparian plot. And 1 year, the timing of either my visit or the bee's emergence with that willow wasn't quite on. That was 2002. It was a earlier spring, so that might have been why. No, that was 2001. It was a later spring in 2002. So it could have been that, or it could have been I just hit it at exactly the right time. But that is a nice spring willow there that's doing that.
Nice. And, I thought one of the things that I wrote down, and I also saw Andoni mention, was that, this interesting phenomenon that, a lot of the rare bees we can't find are specialists, and a lot of the habitat improvements we make are good for generalists and everything. And he really liked the idea, I wrote it down here, of planting for losers. So,
Thanks, Anthony.
I think that ties in with so many things in terms of what you presented, because just like the plant-pollinator interaction stuff, it's really important to know what those pollen hosts are. And chances are our most vulnerable bees are those that are really specific, right? And so any thoughts on, in the realm of sampling or conservation or creating habitat, how you would address those most vulnerable bees, which we in all likelihood have a hard time finding plantings for?
I go so back and forth on this. This one's a hard for me. So I'm going to dive in a little bit to science here of specialist bees, only because when I did it for my PhD, I had to read a lot of papers and it made me pause. So let's think about the specialist bees we know. Name a couple. Let's see. We've got bees that specialize on sunflowers, bees that specialize on cactus, bees that specialize on globe mallow. There's a couple really common plants that have a lot of specialist bees. And those specialist bees picked the plants. They are on the plants that are super abundant, really widespread, very predictable resources that occur across the country, rabbit brush, you name it. the specialist bees are on the plants that seem to persist and have the longest bloom window, whereas the generalist bees kind of have to pick from this smorgasbord of different things that may come and may go from year to year, and maybe they all end up on the rabbit brush with the specialists, and then maybe are at a disadvantage because they don't know how to operate that flower as well as the specialist who does this every year. So I don't think there's data yet to say, but I do wonder one way or another, maybe the specialists have it figured out. Maybe they're on the right track because they're on these plants that aren't going away, and they kind of got a shoe in. It's kind of like, going to the grocery store, and if you go to the same grocery store every time, you can shop really quickly, get what you need, and get out of there, which is important if you have children. But if it's a generalist bee and you're going to this store this day and this and next and the next, you may end up taking a longer time, and it may not be quite as, you're not bringing home quite as much as quickly. I don't know. This is something I debate. I don't have a good answer because I'm still trying to figure that one out.
I like the grocery store comparison. I hadn't actually thought about that before. Not being a parent, you have a unique perspective there, probably. So, I mean, like, there's been some pretty diverse things in here. Here's a pretty unique question. Okay. Are bee genetics susceptible to changes in gene flow associated with habitat loss in urban areas or something like that? Mm-hmm. I'll try and think on it too, but if you know.
Susceptible to gene flow.
Like genetic drift. So one of the problems of urbanization, of course, for folks that are watching is it creates habitat fragmentation. And so I actually got asked this question at the Entomological Society of America meeting this week.
What'd you say?
I'm being a bad scientist right now. I can't recall a specific study that looked at like genetic drift of bees. If there was anything, I would have guessed bumblebees. I know for other pollinator species, I think there has been done, like for butterflies.
There was a paper years ago by, what was his name? Zayed, something like that. And he looked at, he was with Lawrence Packer, and they looked at Lasioglossum and found that it was really easy to end up with conditions that appeared similar to inbreeding because bees are, I just forgot the word, haplodiploid. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with some kind of strange genetics going on there, and you can end up with these males that aren't necessarily contributing as much to the next generation as you would want in terms of genetic diversity. The only other paper I know that might, but this is a little different, but I really enjoyed a recent paper about squash bees that showed that as squash bees have moved from their native range in the Southwest to other areas, the genetic diversity of the populations at the edge of the range have really dropped off. But it was a great way to see where bees had expanded to, and I think we could do that with other bees. I'm thinking about all of in the desert in the West where I do all my work. We have these highways with rainfall off the sides, and they're great places to find bees on all the wildflowers along the edges of roads. And I wonder how many bees have ended up further north or east or west than they ever were before we put in highways. And I wonder if you could tell from genetics what's going on there.
That's an interesting point. It's something I've thought about. So like just a few years ago, we got our first official Colorado Pollinator Highway along Interstate 76, which for those of you that are listening, if you don't know, it's like a northwest corridor through Colorado. What role that could be playing in dispersal, right? And so while we might not know that much about gene flow, that's a central question for connectedness and for like habitat corridors is whether or not bees are able to disperse to those habitats once you make it. So if you build it, will they come? So I told people there that they needed to go research it. We needed to know more. Well, here's another question from Liam. This may be one of our last ones given time because I think we're going to wrap up at 10:15, which kind of is pertinent to things going on here as well as in the Southwest and across the western half of the country is an explanation for why bees tended to like burned areas. And so I know something about this, but I was going to see what you wanted to say about it.
Well, so I know from my own personal experience what I've seen, and I know what I've read about, but the mechanism that's making it so that those areas tend to be so great for bees, I don't understand fully. My guesses about it are that, one, you have this resource release, so you end up with all of that dead and down material, some of which is partway degraded, some of which will be over the next couple of years. I wonder if it makes for a real nice soil condition, lots of stuff in the soil that allows all those plants to come up as they do. But the other thing is, especially where I am, it's all pinyon juniper, which tends to be pretty disparate for bees, and there's nothing going on under there. The sun can't even penetrate. The soils already are poor. It's just not so good. And a burn comes through, opens it up, that nutrient release, and then you end up with this incredible diversity of flowers and downed material for bees to nest in. And the number of like amphibians that I've seen in some of these areas, clearly they're responding to all of that really nice open nesting area. Anyway, those combination of things tend to make for really good environments for bees. And a lot of the, this is good, a lot of the flowers that come in after a burn are super abundant, widespread, really common things that specialist bees just love. And so all of those bees end up there with it. That's what I've seen.
Yeah, and for those who are interested, you can check this out in between sessions too. If you check out the on-demand research stuff on here, we've got representatives from Seth Davis's lab, a little plug here, who actually studies the impact of wildfire on native bee communities. And he's found that, out here, we've got a lot of forests, and that changing forest structure really does open up the understory for those kind of floral resources, which benefits the wild bees. And so there could be, basically some positive impacts of these huge environmental changes that are just happening on scales that we don't perceive, because wildfires have been suppressed for so long, that it's hard for us to gauge those impacts as a natural phenomenon. So,
we think about flowers, and it's so built into any scientist to think about succession. We think about floral succession. We think about overstory succession. But those bees are so tied to the flowers. Is it possible there's a bee succession that's happening right along with that flower succession that we just never really thought about or paid attention to? I don't know. I'm curious about that.
That's a really good question. All right. Well, I'll let everybody ponder that over our break. We're going to take a little 15-minute break now, and we're going to I'll come back in a little bit to introduce our first session. So thanks again so much, Olivia, for such an amazing and fascinating keynote. And can't wait to have you join us at the panel for the discussion.
Very
Thanks
fun.
so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.